Hello and welcome to the AIM webinar series. AIM is a global industry alliance which represents the interest of everyone using barcoding, RFID, and related data capture technologies, including manufacturers, software vendors, integrators, governments, and end users. AIM membership is about supporting standards, community, advocacy, and knowledge. Specifically, you will receive early access to industry technical research and information. Your membership gives you the opportunity to influence the direction of our industry and actively participate in research. AIM is an investment in your future. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes to go over. First, as you may have noticed, all participants are muted throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation though, and if you would like to ask questions, please click the participants button to the bottom of your screen, then select AIM Member Services and submit your questions to me. Today we have ACSIS Chief Strategy Officer John DiPalo discussing the lessons learned from implementing digital supply chain solutions. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the call. I appreciate everyone taking a little bit of time out of their day to spend some time listening to some of the lessons learned that we have built up implementing digital supply chain solutions with some of our customers. I want to spend a little bit of time, a very quick, brief introduction around ACSIS, the company. So ACSIS has been around for over 25 years. We have been working with the Fortune 1000 during that time. And, we have during that time been providing what we call personalized supply chain execution solutions built on a standard cloud platform. So as technology has changed, we have changed with it. So we have seen people move from on-prem solutions to cloud-based solutions. We're going to talk a bit about, what those transitions have meant to companies. And we're also going to talk about how companies that we have worked with and in general industry has started to make a move towards lower level track and trace of product as it moves through their supply chain. We do work actually in three major verticals. So we do work across life sciences, chemical and manufacturing, and CPG. And during that time frame, we've had the opportunity to work with a number of market leaders and have worked with them on their journey from siloed-based systems to centralized ERP instances, and now the big move toward digitization and what that means. So, like all stories, they start, at a point in time and then move forward, right? So, when I first started in this business, kind of in the good old days of manufacturing, you had very much companies vertically integrated, so they had linear supply chains, things were done in sequence. There certainly wasn't nearly the complexity that we have today around customer expectations, around deliveries, and things were more supply driven. So companies would put items out into the marketplace, with a grouping of standards, and folks would purchase from them. In today's world, what we're moving towards and what we've seen across a number of different industries is the fact that traditional supply chains really no longer will suffice for the companies that we work with. And it's gone to much more of a supply network versus a supply chain. And when we look at traditional supply chains and the issues around them, is things tend to very much be siloed from a data perspective. So what is happening in manufacturing is not necessarily fully shared with distribution, which is not necessarily fully shared with demand. And we've also started to see a large number of our customers moving into the third-party model for manufacturing, third-party model for distribution, and the staticness of the systems that support that tend to be, a bit of a limiter in being able to rapidly adapt to changes within the supply chain. So you wind up with these rigid systems that have limited flexibility to them, And we want to start to think about how we can change that. And our experience in assisting customers and working with customers is it's not something you can do overnight, and it's not something that you can do all in one shot. And you really need to think about, how can I look at incremental gains across my supply chain? And the idea of making those incremental gains is really to focus on areas that bring me agility and responsiveness into my supply chain. So when we take a look at how we look at the digital supply chain, it really is, how can I be more dynamic across my supply chain? So how can I respond quicker to things that are happening within my market? How can I scale up or down, based on either new products that I'm going to sell, or new processes, or new regulations that are coming in, or global dynamics around things that are happening around the world. We really start to see a focus, and we believe there's significant value in a truly collaborative supply chain with suppliers, with third-party service providers, manufacturers, subcontractors, service providers. But the area that we want to be able to get to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the presentation, is how can you make your supply chain perceptive? So when things change, how long does it take me to understand that that change has started to occur? And how can I quickly react to either demand signals, or changes in my suppliers, or changes in my third parties, so that I can make sure that my business is both agile and responsive. So the challenge in all this, and I understand that, talking about the digital supply chain and talking about digitizing processes and things like that is a big task. And the challenge is really, how can I look at individual processes? Where do I choose how to start? How can I figure out, from a systems perspective, or from an add-on perspective, or just from a process perspective, kind of where those pain points exist, and start to make that transition to the digital supply chain and have it make sense for my business from both an investment perspective and what I'm going to get from a return on that investment. There are a lot of new technologies in the world. There are a lot of new ways of doing things. And what we find is really working with the right technology at the right point in time and applying that to the right process in order to be able to drive that agility and responsiveness that people are looking for. So what is really, driving the need for this transformation to the digital supply chain, and what is really supporting it, right? And when we take a look across, basically every industry that we work in, if we go down the left side of this particular slide, the industry drivers are really changing the way and the behavior and the expectation level of what customers and what people that are working with product in the supply chain need. So, I know that the Amazon effect and what customer expectations are being driven by the Amazon effect are certainly is a thing that is thrown around a lot, but I do think that there is an impact of that. People work differently. People expect things differently. People expect information delivered differently. So there is a different level of expectation that has been driven, and we can point to Amazon, but certainly you can point to a number of other third parties and processes that are out there. And the bottom line is people expect things to be delivered quicker, often expect things to be delivered in smaller versus larger, either batches or deliveries. The frequency at which people are ordering is changing. So we see a lot of end customer or businesses making their expectations differently. The other thing that we are seeing, and this change certainly has been going on for quite some time, but it continues to accelerate. And it is really a greater dependence on third parties and partners within the supply network. And we're going to actually talk about a couple of different use cases towards the end of my presentation, where companies have moved to this partner model in a very, very significant way. And the challenge of keeping up with that move and being able to quickly incorporate information and processes that you used to do, but now your partners or third parties are doing on your behalf, certainly is a driver for this transformation to the digital supply chain. We see this on a very regular basis, the increased risk and regulatory compliance, right? So, it is a rapidly changing world in which we live in. There are certainly more regulations being put on businesses on a daily basis, and implementation of different regulations across different industries. So we see that as an industry driver. And then one which certainly I'm sure everyone on the call has been affected from time to time, which is the frequency of mergers and acquisitions of organizations and divestitures of organizations. And how do you keep your supply chain dynamic, when you're in the process of merging with another company, acquiring another company, or divesting a business unit? How do your systems work in order to be able to support that? Now, on the IT side, the drivers and, I will also say the capabilities that are now available that were not available, 5-10 years ago, the way they are today, are really supporting this drive to the digital supply chain. So, certainly the big one for me and what we've been doing a lot of work in is the migration of solutions to the cloud and being able to leverage the cloud for transport of information and processes, and being able to use that to integrate unrelated third parties across your supply network. There are challenges that come with that, obviously, around security and making sure that you have solutions that don't have built-in weak spots, because now I don't have an on-prem solution, I now have a cloud solution, and we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the other areas which has driven and changed the way that people work is this ubiquitous mobile access. So the ability for a knowledge worker or a customer or an end consumer through their mobile device to be able to check on the status of things, be able to execute a transaction, be able to have connectivity 24/7 has changed the way that we build solutions, quite honestly, and also has changed the way that people look at how their supply chain is going to work. I mentioned technology earlier, and we'll dig into a couple of these as we go through the presentation. But Internet of Things, and specifically industrial Internet of Things, is changing the way and the amount of data that is available to companies today and how they can leverage that. We see discussions, and we could do a whole presentation on blockchain alone, but as an example, the emergence of data sharing and the emergence of new technologies like blockchain are certainly driving changes in the way that people think. The availability of big data and the cost of storing information has dropped significantly. So now, I combine kind of big data and machine learning together. So the rise of analytics with integrated machine learning capability is certainly a significant driver, and we're starting to see companies get great benefit by tying together machine learning into their processes. It's a little bit early, I think, to talk about artificial intelligence, at this point in time for most industries, but machine learning and being able to do predictive analytics is a huge IT driver. And then the other area that is, a driver plus a requirement as we take a look at this in order to derive value is really this frictionless interoperability between systems. So the ability to share information, with your third parties, the availability, to have your systems, even your internal systems, interoperate so that they can share demand signals and patterns really are a driver that needs to be thought about as we go through this process. So when we think about the world and we think about our vision for the digital supply chain, I try to break it down in a couple of different areas. So, it's my belief that in order to really move to the digital supply chain, that modern supply chains demand transparency. So that is transparency across your internal processes, as well as being able to have a meaningful connection to third parties and partners in your supply chain so that you can see what is going on and understand, if somebody is doing a manufacturing or a subcontracting operation for you, having that transparency to be able to understand where they are in that process in real time or near real time, so that you can see how it will affect your downstream processes, is key to being able to have, this agility and responsiveness that I talked about earlier. And the other point that I like to talk about, and we'll come back to this again as well, is, you really need to think about how can I leverage my existing systems. So, most companies that we talk with today have a significant, investment in their ERP backbone. They have a significant investment in existing systems. Yet the world around them is changing at a very rapid pace, and it's very dynamic. So how can you put a solution around those existing systems of record that add value at the edge and allow you to rapidly change the processing that's going on either at a plant level, at a node level, with partners? So, that whole concept of having a system of record that runs your business on a daily basis and does not need to be adapted for every single change that you want to make, with things that are going on the edge of your supply chain, is a key philosophy that we like to think about and talk with our customers about. And basically having intelligence both at your system of record plus intelligence at the edge is a key vision that you need to think about. So I'm going to spend kind of a few moments here, talking about what I think is a reasonable approach, to building a path to the digital supply chain. And one of the concepts that gets kicked around a lot and gets talked about is this concept of the digital twin. So as I have either products or assets or systems, that are being, sent through my supply chain, how can I build up this digital twin within my digital supply chain so that I can have a digital representation of the products that are moving through my supply chain? So keep that thought in mind as you think about these building blocks. So for me, the number one building block in order to have a robust digital supply chain solution is really being able to capture high definition data at the source as it's happening. So that foundation is key in order to start the journey of being able to build out that digital twin and being able to have a true digital supply chain solution. Then what we want to be able to do is really apply the context to that source data. And what I mean by that is, in traditional systems, you'd capture data at a batch level or at a SKU level. And really, we want to start to get below that level. So being able to uniquely identify items as they're moving through your supply chain, and then provide context data or apply context data to that information. And that context data should be something that's flexible. And what I mean by, flexible context data is, as an example, if I'm moving cold chain product through my supply chain, I want to be able to apply context data of what was the temperature when that product was loaded? What was the temperature when it was unloaded? What was, the temperature as it was received, at a third party? And then if at any point in time during its journey, I have an issue, I will quickly be able to take action based on that context data that is applied to that unique item that is now flowing through the supply chain. Then we get into the integration of that information. And this was what I talked about earlier, where we have systems of record that we want to be able to use, but then tie that unique identified data and its associated context data together to really give you a system of engagement. And that is what your users, it's what your systems should strive towards, is not having necessarily a single system of record, but a system of engagement that can tie multiple systems together to give you a complete picture of what's going on within your supply chain. Once you have those items, you can then really start to take a look at how can I integrate processes to give me integrated process management and drive those digital processes through the network. And that includes sharing those with your third parties. It includes including your customers or your end users in that process. And then ultimately, what that allows you to do as a company or as a business is really take a look at your entire supply network and treat it as a virtual enterprise and allow you to dynamically adjust to changes that are going on. And you notice that the agility word has really, kind of at the end of this journey, you will actually become more agile and more responsive at each step in the journey. But once you have all of these different pieces put together, we really feel that you then have this concept of a virtual enterprise that allows you to track product as it moves through your entire supply chain, incorporate partners as necessary, in some cases, remove partners that are not working up to your standards. But that whole concept of a virtual enterprise, I believe to be key in the virtual or in the digital supply chain. So at the end of the day, the box that just is on the bottom of this slide, I think sums it up, is that, the unprecedented agility that allows organizations to capture, manage, and leverage uniquely identified context-aware data throughout the supply chain. I don't often read off of my slides, but I think that that's an important concept in how you think about migrating to the digital supply chain. Now, having said all of that, it's not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not something you're going to do tomorrow. It's not something that happens immediately. And we actually have a couple of use cases and case studies that we're going to go through at the end of this presentation with different organizations that we've worked with that really talk about how they made the transition to the digital supply chain or are making the transition to the digital supply chain by really pointing at the issues that are of highest priority first, solving those, and then moving forward, but all with this concept in mind of having, everything have these 5 building blocks built into those solutions. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I call a reference architecture and, talk about some components which I believe to be important in the digital supply chain and really some things to think about, right? And when we talk about the transformation, you really need to think about all of the different components and all of the different pieces of the puzzle that are important to getting to the digital supply chain. So, the concept here, if we take a look at this reference architecture, is we certainly have a grouping of ERP systems or an un-ERP system, and then a whole host of supporting systems. And I look at those as key because those are where your business transactions happen. It's where the financial transactions happen within your business. But in order to do things like be able to rapidly bring in partners or third parties or have mobile access to those processes, that's where the cloud starts to come in from our perspective. So having cloud-based processes, having cloud-based data management, which has the pieces of information necessary in order to share data across all of these different partners and stakeholders in the supply chain is key. One of the other areas which we have learned through a lot of work with our customers is not every process is applicable to be directly connected to the cloud. As more and more devices become smart and more devices move into the industrial IoT or Internet of Things, this is where you're going to get a large amount of your information. So what tended to be entered by people, at terminals or as part of a production or manufacturing operation, now can be entered or can be managed by devices that are sitting on the shop floor, devices that are within your network. And this is where we feel it's important to have the edge computing power that is not necessarily in the cloud, right? So that will be potentially on-prem within a manufacturing or distribution operation, but that solution needs to be able to take information. So I want to take some time and go through the case studies here. And what we will be talking about are 3 different case studies within our, that have implemented different versions of the digital supply chain. So we have a, first one comes from the chemical space, and where they were started was they had a very large subcontractor network north of 200 third parties that were doing production and distribution across their supply chain. So the challenge for them was how to get the status of all of those production orders, all of those shipments across a global network that included, hundreds of different third parties, all integrated into their SAP system. So if we go back to how they used to do it, it was phone, fax, email, and other activities in order to get the production status of third parties. And if we take a look at the product flow, it actually spanned across 3 different continents in order to make the finished product. So as you can imagine, that is a very, very daunting task to do all of that manually. So the solution and what they were looking to do was to really build what they called a real-time and what we put forward, a multimodal environment to allow all of the different third parties to be connected. So we put in a private cloud solution for them where the third parties could connect to the solution, and the key for them was they needed to be able to connect to the solution in the way that their technology allowed them to. So for some third parties, that was a portal where somebody was entering information. For others, it was an EDI message. For others, it was a flat file or an email that could be, rapidly imported into a solution. So we had to work with them on a solution that would allow input from all those different types, all those different devices, all of those different ways of sharing information. And it would normalize it and drive that into their SAP system in real time. So they went from a huge lag in production status and delivery status to near real-time connectivity across their supplier network. Now, there were certainly some lessons that we learned during this process. So the first one, which I mentioned earlier, was that not all partners are created equal. So you cannot force a technology on a wide variety of partners. We learned that very early. Your adoption comes to the classic 80-20, where 80% of the partners can do it and 20% can't. The problem was we found that most of the issues they had were with the 20% who couldn't. So by having this multimodal approach and allowing them to have multiple ways of connecting solved a significant number of issues. The other thing which became readily apparent and something to think about as you go down this journey is intuitive onboarding is key. So the ability to bring partners on or potentially bring them off rapidly is a must, because partners change, processes change. In fact, this particular customer had one of their divisions that utilized the solution was seasonal in nature. So they would routinely onboard 30% of their partners on an annual basis, and they would change over time. So being able to have intuitive onboarding and utilization of the solution is a must. And then what they learned also was that the issues they were able to see were much quicker to be able to create it because they were seeing issues much earlier than they had in the past. And because they could understand upstream issues much earlier, they were able to very quickly remediate supply chain issues that they had. Now, what was the ROI for this particular project? They actually did a time study, and they were able to onboard partners 90% faster from a time and a cost perspective when you include the cost of onboarding and training new partners. They had a 50% reduction in transaction processing costs because the transactions were no longer being double entered. They were being managed completely by exception. the significant increase in the accuracy of their order status. So that includes manufacturing orders as well as delivery orders. And then, one which was interesting, which showed over time, was they saved significant money in the ability to lower expedited shipping costs because of this enhanced visibility. So if in fact they were going to be had a shipment that was going to be delayed, or had a shipment that that potentially was not going to be delivered in the time that it needed to be, they could understand that much earlier and make arrangements to either ship substitute product or be able to work on the logistics of getting product to where it needed to be. So huge win across a very diverse customer base. That was a first step for them in this transition to the digital supply chain. So if you can imagine going from reams of emails and faxes and people calling up to find out the status of things, to basically understanding product flow in real time or near real time, there was a huge benefit there. Now the next thing the next phase of this project is really start to take that very granular data and make actionable dashboards so that supplier scorecards and production analytics become available to them, so that they can start to really understand the efficiency of their supply network. So another case study that we'll talk about is with a garment rental company. So, interesting one from a technology perspective, because with this customer, they have about 200 million garments, serialized individual garments that all have unique attributes to them, that are spread across 225 facilities that all need to be integrated back into their SAP system. So from a solution perspective, we work with them on the serialization of each individual item as it goes through the supply chain, and each item has a unique set of attributes that are associated with it, that are tracked across from the time that the garment is initially onboarded until the time it is retired, with a couple of interesting exceptions there. The solution allowed them to eliminate all of their paper processes from goods receipt all the way through shipping. And the one which I think is an interesting case study is, the decision was taken that we would put a IoT gateway or an edge solution at each facility to support store and forward capability in the event of a network outage or in the event of a wide area network slowdown. Because in order to process these 200 million garments efficiently, it was important to have 1/4 second or less response time from each scan that was utilized. And the only way to achieve that was by ensuring that we had this IoT gateway that would process these scans in real time. The other piece was there was a number of the facilities have automation equipment, and that automation equipment obviously runs at a certain pace, and the IoT gateway allows us to isolate any of their latency issues with the cloud solution from the individual facilities. So what we learned from that over time, and this was actually a bit of the dynamic nature of being able to change a solution as you learn things. What we learned is that not everything requires the same level of provenance over time. So it's very, very important for, in this case, when a garment is in use, for it to keep all of its attributes and be able to understand all of where it's been and how many times it's been washed or worn or all those types of things. But when it moves back into stock, it may not be as important. So the ability to dynamically adjust how you store data and how you leverage that information becomes very important. Now, there's other types of garments that they manage where it is super important to be able to keep the attributes for the life of the garment. So having that dynamic capability is key. Now, the other thing we learned is, once you're used to 1/4 second response time, it's very difficult to go back to processing things via paper and pen. So what was the ROI for this transition?
Well, 100% visibility of all of the garments across their supply network. During this process, there were some black holes that they didn't have full visibility or transparency of their solution. So during the process, we picked up, 20% of what was previously invisible. So when you look at a CapEx cost of supplying new product, they could actually reuse existing product because we were able to identify where all of that product was and be able to leverage that across their network. Perfect order index up to 99.99% because we were able to scan everything in and out at a very, very quick response time. And then a significant reduction in labor costs for initial receipt and provisioning of garments. And then the last case study I'm going to talk about is we've actually done this for a number of different customers. And it is, I'll highlight one for specialty gas, and this is in the use of returnable assets and being able to manage the status of a returnable asset wherever it is. And this is where we did a combination of different technologies and integrated that back into their ERP system, utilizing RFID and barcode. So we were talking about returnable assets across the supply chain. And the thing that we learned around doing this particular project is that you can onboard assets as you're moving them and track them. The process of completely understanding the life cycle of assets was very beneficial for this particular customer. So the ability to track maintenance and inspection information and then tie that digitally along with the asset so that anyone within the supply chain could understand the asset status, could understand when it was last maintained, could understand its last inspection, was hugely beneficial. And then the one that came across and where we talked about earlier, the ability to integrate information across systems provided some unique benefits. Now, one of the problems that we see with customers that are utilizing returnable transport items to move product is oftentimes in their ERP system, they're an unconstrained asset. So when you run capacity planning or availability to promise, you get a good picture of your product or your manufacturing capacity, but you may not get a complete picture of the assets or the returnable items that you transport those in. So by combining all of that information together, we were able to very accurately predict not only what their manufacturing capacity was, but would they have enough returnable transport items in order to move and manage those assets. So, that concept of tying multiple systems together to get a more complete picture of your supply chain and then digitally representing that via dashboarding was key to the ROI on this particular project. And then from an ROI perspective, again, 100% visibility of those returnable items across their supply network. They really looked at, once they were able to identify all of those returnable transport items, plus their status, plus their maintenance and inspection history, they determined that they actually needed about 20% less than they were carrying to support their production levels. So there was a significant reduction in both storage for those assets as well as the capital expense to buy them. A big reduction in inspection and maintenance costs because we were managing the inspection and maintenance in a much more proactive way. We were able to bulk inspect and maintain assets in a more efficient manner. And then finally, there was a significant reduction here as well in rush shipments because what would happen was they would plan a production run and then understand that they didn't have enough returnable transport items to support that. So they would have to either purchase new ones or rush ship those into the facility so that they could manage those shipments. So some examples of solutions plus benefits. And as I wrap this up here, my key takeaways that I want to talk about here are quick wins. Like quick wins are important. So how can I pilot solutions? How can I have a manageable scope and a measurable goal from an ROI perspective so that I can yield results quickly, show those results to management, and be able to expand my project. The other thing that becomes really important, and we took away from multiple of these projects, is understanding your partner ecosystem. So what does it mean, not only for you, but for your partners? If you're going to extend digital transformation across your supply network, are your partners able to participate? The data picture, and that, remember, was the first building block of my transformation to the digital supply chain. If you can't get the granular data that you need, the results will be limited. So it really is important to look at the lowest level of information that you're able to capture, and then be able to translate that into transactional information in your ERP system. But don't be afraid to capture more information than you think you are going to need, because ultimately you will need it. And then the other piece, and the last piece I'll leave everyone with here before we open it up for questions, is what is the viability of new technology? So the example, and I'm not a blockchain naysayer, I'm a blockchain realist, but I'll use it as an example. There's a lot of hype from blockchain around digital supply chain, but is it the right thing to do? In some cases, it absolutely is. But when you take a look at your technology options, make sure that you're picking the best option, or are there other technologies that can provide similar functionality? So, those are my key takeaways, from some of the projects that we work with and talking with industry leaders. And with that, and I apologize for some of the audio issues, but I'm happy to turn it over, Michael, to you if there were any questions that came in.
Yeah, I will. So we have several questions. There's still time if you want to submit a question. Just at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat icon. Just click that and it'll send it right to me. First question we have is what are leaders in supply chain management doing to address sustainability?
That is a great question. It's a broad question. I certainly think that, from a sustainability perspective, even in some of the examples that I gave, there certainly was, I don't know that that was the focus from a project perspective when they first started, but some of the side benefits that came out of them around lower carbon footprint on transportation, the ability to manage returnable assets in such a way that I'm not procuring as many, so from a sustainability perspective, certainly, there are angles there. We probably could do an entire webinar just on sustainability across the supply chain, but anytime that you can eliminate either processes or eliminate transportation, unnecessary transportation, certainly that speaks towards sustainability. I don't know that, as I mentioned, any of the projects that we talked about started with sustainability, but there are certainly sustainability angles across all of them.
Okay, another question we received, I think this is about the case studies or use cases you presented. Are these $100 million solutions, 10 million, 1 million?
Great question. So they're certainly not 100 million. I think that the numbers are always tough to put out there, but I think that they're $1 million solutions in round numbers. Obviously, depending on how you structure them and how you build them out, that number, your mileage will vary depending on what it is that you're looking to do. But every one of them had an ROI based in it, and I think that's important to take a look at. What you're going to expend, and then how can I get a return on that, both hard ROI as well as a soft ROI. And we do work with customers on their business cases, and short of total. And you'll notice I didn't bring up any examples that were purely compliance-based examples, because that's a different animal entirely. All of the solutions we talked about here had fixed ROIs to them that were expected and achieved. So there's always solutions also that you look at, from a compliance perspective. But even those, if done correctly, can generate a return.
Okay, another question we received is how many of your implementation use cases used RFID tracking, and to what extent do they use it by use case?
Great question. So the primary one was the third use case. So the returnable transport item, that leveraged RFID. The second one, there are industries that do use RFID for tracking of soft goods, garments, things like that. So RFID is an interesting technology. When we have done, when Walmart did their RFID mandate a number of years back, we participated very heavily in that process. And we learned an awful lot about what you can do with RFID and what you can't do with RFID. And I'm happy to say that RFID technology has improved significantly from that time until now. And when I take a look at RFID as an option for traceability in the supply chain, it is a viable option from both a cost and a technology perspective for almost any of the use cases we talked about. But it is not, a silver bullet that will get you everywhere that you want to go. So RFID has its place in track and trace, and I think it's a very viable technology, but typically combined with others in order to get a complete picture and allow all participants in your supply network to actually be able to leverage the information. So we often see a combination of barcode, RFID, and other technologies at work as we go through implementations.
Okay, and the next question we have, these technologies that give us big data, give access to so much information, it can lead to multiple interpretations of the data. How do you form useful analytics from that data?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. The term, and the kind of the job that is coming, to be pretty hot in supply chain today is this data scientist role. And it is really important, for the very reason that when you're looking at big data sets that can be interpreted, you do have to build models that make sense. And those models need to be refined over time. We find it to be a little bit challenging at the start to go too big from a data model perspective. So what we like to do is evolve our data models over time based upon feedback and real information that comes, from the supply chain, and then add more and more data to support those models. And we find that approach to be to give us the most accurate modeling. But the concept of that you'll start with a huge data set and immediately it will be correct is probably a stretch. So I think that that's an evolutionary process. And having that data model in place and having a data scientist that understands how to leverage that information is key to success in the big data world.
Okay, great. And another question we received, is collaboration on a digital supply chain really possible if people and organizations are using different platforms to achieve a digital supply chain?
Yeah, good question there as well. It is possible. There are standards bodies, that help out in that space, obviously, and the key to a true interoperability is having some level of agreement across parties as to what is going to be shared, the vehicle that it's going to be shared. As I mentioned in the first case study, which incorporated a couple of hundred different supply chain partners all running different technologies. That one was viable because A, there was a dominant partner involved who was driving the process, and B, the transactions and the transaction set that was being shared was focused on a particular supply chain. So that's why we feel that personalized supply chain network makes the most sense, because it allows a partner who works with a number of different suppliers to be able to control the processes and be able to manage the processes and collaborate with their partners. I think it becomes more difficult, not impossible, more difficult when you have multiple dominant partners in the mix and kind of going through different vehicles to drive that process. So again, my counsel is start with a process that makes sense, drive it through, and you may have multiple kind of personalized supply chain processes in order to drive that digitization. So it's not something you start at the end and you're fully digitized, but you can certainly work towards that end.
Okay, and the last question that I have for you here today, with customer demand never stopping, how does an organization transition and still meet demands without some sort of slowdown?
Yeah. Now that's all these questions are super. My compliments to the audience. It's a great set of questions. So that's why I think that picking your pain points becomes key. So you're not going to boil the ocean, right? So when we looked at all of these, most of these solutions, we looked at a particular problem first, and that could be getting production streamlined across your third parties. It could be ensuring that product is shipped with a perfect order index as high as you can get it in order to support your customers. And it also starts with a reasonably scoped pilot that then moves forward from there. And I've used this in the past, but and anyone on the line can feel free to use it. I call it the 3 Ps of all solutions, right? So pilot becomes production and production becomes permanent. So having a well-scoped pilot that allows you to test out different things and then move that into production in a way that makes sense allows you to try out the technology, understand what it does, understand how it fits in your infrastructure, and also allows you to gain benefit quickly. And then you move and iterate that through the process. So, in my opinion, in today's world, with all of the demands and all of the moving parts, that's the key, is to start it at a level and then grow it out from there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time today, John. We really appreciate your insights.
And thanks to everyone on the phone. Again, my apologies for a few of the little audio blips, and we'll work on that for the next one.
Yep. And thank you to our audience again for their active participation today. Once again, thanks everyone, and have a great day.